Today's class is on our writer's parts and labor pricing metrics, and what we'll be teaching in the class is an overview of parts and labor matrix and how it works, and then we'll get into the actual pricing setup. It's to be noted that Auto Apps Inc., Bruce and Paul Stewart are not affiliated with our writer, and Progressive Automotive Systems, our writer is a registered trademark of Progressive Automotive Systems. So with that, I want to thank one of our good shop owners for allowing me to use their data and to use it to teach the class on parts and labor pricing matrix. We're going to start with Brian and just look at Brian. And there's what you'll be hearing from me throughout all the classes is what we call best practices. One of the best practices is to, when the parts are red, that means the parts haven't come in yet. So when we look at this, we want to be able to see which parts haven't come here, and then once you receive the parts, which we'll be discussing in accounts payables class on receiving parts, how they'll turn black once you receive the parts through accounts payable. In this case, we're going to look at the hub bearing, and you're going to look at a 62% margin. You have a cost of $48 and a price of $128. So if we go up here to Smart Pricing and click on the question mark, you'll see that we're using linear pricing. The supplier's factory motor parts. You can see the cost multiplier, and you can see all the rules that we've used, and that's what we'll be discussing today. You can see we're using the rounding rule of rounding up to the next 5, so it's rounded up a penny. So with that, what we're going to be talking about is, in best practices, you're going to require department, and you're going to require invoice number. So that is what will keep the part red until you actually receive that part. So you'll put the department in when you see it. Now this is a pricing curve. Now if this happened to be a dealer part, you'll notice instead of being $128, it changes to $116 because we have a different pricing metrics for dealer parts. So we can have multiple pricing schedules or linear pricing curves. In this case, we're just going to leave this at factory. That shows you how we'll be setting up for linear pricing. At the same time, we want to look at labor. And with labor, we're going to talk about smart pricing on labor. You'll notice this is 2 hours for doing this hub bearings, and the labor rate's at 109. But with smart pricing, you can see if I unclick it, it's really 119.70. But what smart pricing lets you do is this is where you pick up for your shop supplies and all the fees that you can't necessarily charge extra for and wave black flags. So it lets you increase your labor rate over a gradual curve and still pay the technician the 2 hours. So again, clicking on the question mark, you can see we're using a 1.11 multiplier, and that's where we're getting the calculated price of $243. So this is smart labor pricing. I'll be showing you how to do that through the configuration module. So where this starts is we'll be looking at setting best practices for setting the parts pricing method. You're going to see that I recommend an inventory linear pricing by department. I recommend linear pricing by supplier in outside purchases. You want to disable the smart pricing by default, and one thing you would want to always click is when parts are not in stock, use the parts inventory rules, because what that will do is use the rules you've set up for what parts you normally stock, and not use the rules that would be way out of your way different than. We'll go into outside purchasing pricing, and we'll talk about your actual matrix curve. Instead of just having the stair-step effect, we'll talk about labor pricing, smart labor pricing, and then we're going to talk about required entries and how to bring all this together. So this is what we now will do is jump into configuration, and we'll go into configuration again, and go into parts. And the first one, as we talked about, is set your pricing metrics. And as I said here, you got multiple entries, but matrix pricing by department would be a stair step, meaning that from 0 to 5, it would be one price, and then up to, so it's a stair step. What the linear does, it lets you have the pricing gradually go up. So for parts, we're going to do linear pricing by department. Outside purchases, linear pricing by supplier. We're going to disable the smart pricing by default. What this would do, before you close an invoice, it actually start prompting you for pricing changes, and you don't want to do that. And then again, my best practice recommendation is when parts are not in stock, use the parts inventory rules, but these need to be set up correctly. So as we do that, we're going to jump into parts, and we're going to first jump into inventory pricing. So in inventory pricing, you're going to have 0 to 5 is going to be different multipliers, up to 10, up to 20. You can see this is a fairly aggressive client that wants to achieve a 60% margin overall on all his parts. You can look at your sales analysis on your default pricing and run your analysis for any date range, and it will show you what your margin is in that $0 to $5 range, 5 to 10, 10 to 20. So this lets you see the overall margin and your aggregated margin. So this allows you to look at this. You can also do it and manage it by departments, and I'll show you a little bit about that. So you could have a default pricing metrics, but also have a different pricing metrics for new tires, or a different pricing metrics for batteries. And so in this case, batteries are set at a 35% margin. So this is where you can go in this case, you would go in and actually add your batteries to that matrix name, and then it would price anything in that department with that matrix. You have the ability to round up to 5s or 9s or 50s. So in this case, they've chosen, and then it'll always let you. So if we looked at, let's say that cost you, let's go back to the default pricing. So let's say in this case, we have a multiplier of 2.8 and then 2.55. If that part costs $60, you're going to see the multiplier will happen in between the 0.8 and 0.255. So it's 2.62. So that's how the linear curve works for pricing out parts based on your cost of that part. So with that, you can go in and you can do different things like disable pricing for certain inventory items. And that's for your inventory curve. And then as we go back to configuration parts, and we want to look at outside purchases. Outside purchases is a little bit different. Instead of being battery and tires, we're going to set it up for dealer parts or BG products, or you could even set up tires here too, and this is where you would set it up by supplier. So like in the dealer parts, you would simply have suppliers included in this price metric would be your different dealer parts. So you may have a dealer that only gives you 15% discount in different market areas. Well, you may want a pricing curve just for that particular dealer. So this lets you set up by clicking on new, multiple different types of linear pricing. Again, if you're looking at this and you're looking at it costs you $75 and you calculate it, you can see we're rounding it up to 5. And what you're going to see is this is a 2.32 margin. So that cost multiplier is in between these two. So this is what sets your linear curve for your pricing. This is where you can set up your different matrices, and again, you can do your sales analysis based on that information and see what your overall margin would be based on looking at your sales dollars. So you can see your sales dollars, you can see your cost, and you can see your margin and your percent of that total depending on where you were in that pricing range that you set up. So with that, we next would go into labor, and we go into smart labor pricing. And with smart labor pricing, you're going to see here on anything from $0 to $120, I don't want to increase my pricing, meaning that on any of my maintenance work, my oil changes, all that, I don't want the labor to be affected. But anything starting at 120 up to 200, I'm going to have different multipliers here. Again, it lets you round up to 5 or 9 or whatever you wanted, or the 50s or 99s. So in this case, as we were talking about, if you took 2 hours at that, it'd normally be $219. But by applying, and what you'll need to do is click on this button right here, use Smart Pricing. You can calculate it, and it gives you the out-the-door price of $243.90 as it adjusted it up to the nearest 5. So again, you can have different, like you may have one for heavy line. You can exclude categories and operations in these different ones. So in this case, you can set it up and have multiple different markups or even decreases for that matter. If you wanted to go less on certain things, you could actually have a linear curve for that. So this lets you set up multiple curves for your different labor operations that you want to exclude, or labor category, the whole category that you want to exclude. So this is your labor, your smart labor pricing, and this is where your setup would be. And from that, what it lets you just do under the hood is be able to go in and just intuitively update the pricing just by changing the hours. So if I went to 3, it automatically just smart prices it, and you can see the difference there by turning that on. And then the same thing with smart pricing, outside purchases, and for inventory pricing. So this is the Parts and Labor Matrix Pricing class overview and setup in configuration.